Okay, let's start. Good afternoon, good evening in Israel, and good day wherever you are. I see that we have a lot of people from Europe. I'm Alon Confino. I teach at UMass Amherst, and I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. On behalf of myself and of Amos Goldberg, who is the Jonah Machover Chair in Holocaust Studies at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University, and the head of the Avraham Harman Research Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. On behalf of both of us, I'd like to welcome you to another year of Encounters. Encounters is a program launched by our institutes last year, a new transnational program, a series of meetings on new books in the research field of our institutes: human rights, Holocaust, genocide, mass violence, antisemitism, discrimination, Islamophobia, and the like. Our aim is to bring every year a series, 4 or 5 scholars who have written new important books and to have conversations with them. The idea is to offer a unique opportunity for a broad audience, certainly across from Israel to the US, a broad audience, scholars and lay people interested in these topics across national borders, to be acquainted with the most recent works in the topics. This year, Encounters will focus on conversations on antisemitism, racism, and Islamophobia. We are going to have 5 meetings from now until May, and you will soon see a link to the entire program in the chat. I'd like to remind us that next conversation will take place with Sol Goldberg and Scott Uri on their co-edited volume, together with Kalman Weiser, Key Concepts in the Study of Antisemitism. This will take place on November 16th. Last year, our program brought in hundreds of viewers. If you are interested to see the events, they were recorded and can be seen on our YouTube channel or on the websites of the institutes. This event also will be recorded. Let me remind you of the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can post questions only there and whenever you want, anytime during the event. You can also follow us on Facebook and see the events of our institutes. And finally, it's my great pleasure and distinct honor to have with us today Dirk Moses, who, frankly, also looking by the amount of people who joined us, needs no introduction, but I am very happy to introduce him nonetheless. Dirk is a Frank Porter Graham Distinguished Professor of Global Human Rights History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has written extensively about German genocide and global history. He has been for many years the editor of the Journal of Genocide Research and is one of the premier scholars and premier voices about genocide in the world today and for some years. Together with other scholars, about 20 years ago, when he was still young, but I think he was already bold, he and other scholars started the discipline of genocide studies, brought it to the attention of scholars in history and in the humanities. And the journal that he edited became a flashpoint and a flagship for these concerns. Dirk's latest book, which is at the center of our meeting today, is The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security and the Language of Transgression, which appeared in February 2021 and has already generated a lively discussion about the field. So it's a great pleasure for Amos and me to have Dirk with us. And Amos, I'm giving the word to you.
Okay, thank you, Alon, and thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you everybody for joining us. Okay, let's jump immediately into the issues at stake. So you are the editor of a Journal of Genocide Research, and as Alon just said, you're a very major player in this field of genocide history, genocide studies. But your book is called The Problems of Genocide. You have you spell it very clearly out there that you have a great problem with the concept itself of our field. So are you quite serious about the fact that there are major and fundamental problems with this very concept? And could you tell us a bit about how you see these problems and what you mean actually by that? And a follow-up question is, so what are the implications? What are the implications for the field and but let's start with just setting up.
Okay, well, thanks first for the invitation. It's a real honor to be with you and a pleasure as well. I mean, I've known Alon since the early 90s when I was a graduate student at Notre Dame, and we invited him as a newly minted assistant professor at UVA to come and talk about his work on Harman. I mean, that's around 1993. And then I think, Amos, you and I met when I was a research fellow at the Hebrew University in 2007. So it's, you know, we've had intersecting paths over the years, and here we are now, and I'm very glad that we can talk about these issues about which we all care deeply. Now, just to correct one thing from Alon's generous introduction, I certainly didn't found the field of genocide studies. I mean, that, you know, was more or less crystallized in the late 80s and the 90s. And then, you know, this Journal of Genocide Research only became a formal journal, I think, in 1999. You know, to give you a sense of how recent this field is, I became the senior editor in 2011, so nearly 20 years later. I mean, what my generation X did, though, in the early 2000s was to affect, or to try to affect, a colonial turn in genocide studies, which had been hitherto restricted to, if you like, in the canonical genocides of the 20th century, the Armenian genocide, maybe some of Stalinist crimes, depending on where you sat in the Cold War, you know, whether you were, you know, Ukrainian advocate, certainly the Holocaust, obviously, at the center. And then you skipped 30 years to the Cambodian genocide, and then almost another 20 years to Rwanda and Srebrenica and so forth in the first half of the 1990s. And then in the later iterations, depending on your cast of mind, you would include Darfur in, you know, 2005, 6, 7. So it was very patchy, very selective, and you know, no courses that we knew of, no people teaching this, and very few people writing about it would include pre-20th century genocides, and certainly not those in the settler colonies. And you can tell from my accent, I come from one. It's called Australia. No one was interested in genocide in Australia except some indigenous intellectuals. And the same could be said for the US in general. Now, that's changed in the last 20 years. We now have a growing literature on the question of genocide in these countries, and not just those. And we have a much broader spectrum of cases which we can try to study under the rubric of genocide. So I spent the first half of my career at my PhD in 2000 and taught mainly at the University of Sydney, trying to conceptually stretch the concept to include settler colonial cases and those kinds of things. With mixed success. Yes, there has been growth in the literature and in our academic community, but certainly not in public discussion. Whenever one tries to bring it up, in the newspapers, with politicians, they go, "Well, what are you talking about? That's not a genocide. The Holocaust is a genocide. That's the gold standard, or the archetype, or the ideal type." And it dawned on me after witnessing this again and again that there are limits to conceptual stretching, which is a term that political scientists use. trying to, expand concepts so you can, fit more cases into it. There was a limit to that, and that, in fact, the Holocaust as the archetype of genocide was baked into the DNA of the concept. And that was one of the problems of genocide, and that led to a series of others. Because the Holocaust is the gold standard of genocide, other cases of mass destruction of civilians are regarded, in order to gain attention for them, advocates for those peoples then try to make their cases resemble the Holocaust. And I've seen that go on right now with the Uyghur case, where I received an article at the Journal where someone made direct analogies with the Holocaust, with Nazi Germany. I said to them, I don't think in these specifics what's happening in Xinjiang has that much to do with Germany in the 1930s and 40s. But why do you feel compelled to do this? In the history of violence against civilians, there are so many cases, and the Uyghur case will be one. But why do you keep relating it to Nazi Germany? Why is that? Why do you feel that compulsion, right? That is certainly one of the problems of genocide, and it's got to do with the centrality of the Holocaust in our culture, which I welcome, and I'm not against that, obviously. But as an academic, we have to understand, how it then structures the politics of recognition of human suffering. What are the insights and what are the blindnesses? And what I'm pointing to in the book is that there are considerable blindnesses. I mean, when you think about the sorry tale of mass civilian destruction in the 20th century, you'll find that most of them are not included in a genocide studies book or course, an undergraduate lecture course. Mass bombing of civilians, famines caused by, say, the Great Leap Forward in China. Some people talk about 45 million people. Now, genocide is just not the right term, is it? It's not the genocide. And yet, it's not at all on our horizon. It doesn't shock the conscience of mankind or humanity, to use this old-fashioned terminology that you see even today in people talking about, humanitarian emergencies, right? They talk about the Holocaust and some other cases as shocking our conscience or a stain on our conscience. And I was intrigued by this language, which I ended up calling the language of transgression, okay? And I decided to write a history of it in this book. Like, how did we end up with these problems of genocide where the Holocaust has set the threshold so high of that which shocks the conscience of mankind? I mean, where does this language of shocking conscience mankind come from anyway? As an historian, I decided to go looking, and I traced it back to Las Casas and his short history of the destruction of in the Indies, or the Indians, in the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish. And there I saw the crystallization of a certain style of denunciation of state atrocities. And he uses language very similar to what we see today. And I traced this language in 2 long chapters in the book, about 90 pages, over 500 years, the career of that notion of humanity, or, in his day, it was Christendom, right? He was speaking about Christendom, but it's secularized in the Enlightenment. And that the affectual history of shocking, like, why do some things shock you and others don't, right? Even though people are suffering in all cases, right? What is above and what is below that threshold? Who sets that threshold? All these things are historically contingent rather than natural occurring categories or emotional reactions. And we can write a history of that. That's one of the exciting things that historians do. So I trace the history of that style of denouncing state atrocities over 500 years. And the context is nearly always conquest and occupation, whether in Europe or whether outside Europe, okay? There's an imperial nexus or colonial nexus of some kind. And there were plenty of colonial and imperial scandals, including slavery, which has certainly shocked people in the abolition movement over the last 500 years. And what I show, and it might be jumping ahead here a bit, Amos, is that Lemkin draws from this to create this new word of genocide. And so it's actually not the revolutionary creation of something new, but at the end point of a linguistic or semiotic history in mainly in Western consciousness, but it's globalized after the war. Now, just to go back to the problems of genocide, the issue with the Holocaust as the archetype of genocide is the following, and this is a very important conceptual point and distinction for everyone to understand, right? The way the Holocaust has been understood, certainly by certain actors at the time, but certainly as it's constructed since then and until the present day, is an attack on a hapless minority which was not engaged in any kind of partisan or political or military activity. Now, certainly that is true, especially in relation to German Jews, who are a tiny minority. We're not engaged in an uprising against Germans, right? Any Germans. Now, in a sense, it's a depoliticization of what a mass crime is, because the actors are not engaged in any political nexus one another. The attack on Jews, according to this image, was purely driven by hate. You know, Jews were killed solely on the grounds of their identity, purely for being Jews, killed as Jews, for being Jews, not for anything they'd done, but just for who they are. Okay? And that notion of a hate crime, and at a meta level, of course, in the Holocaust, has become ubiquitous. And there is a lot of truth to it, incidentally. I'm not saying there's no element of truth to it. Now, the problem is that when genocide, when the Holocaust becomes the DNA or archetype of genocide, is that other cases of mass violence against civilians, which nearly always occur in the context of a civil war or an uprising or a secessionist conflict, in which there is political agency on the part of some members of the victim group, you know, can't fit the archetype. Okay, so what happens is that in the case of the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example, where, you know, there have been a mass ethnic cleansing with genocidal overtones of Rohingya and Rakhine state, mainly into Bangladesh, with you know, high mortality. The Rohingya say, we are being attacked solely because we're Rohingya. In response, the Myanmar military and state goes, no, there were attacks by a Rohingya militia on our police stations, which there were, incidentally. Not many, but there were. And so we are taking legitimate security measures. You know, the rhetoric of security also saturates the legitimation strategies of the Chinese state in relation to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They say there are Uyghur separatists, and there are some, right? So we need to take these measures to ensure that this is snuffed out, because we have a right as a sovereign state to prevent secessions. You know, I think the Americans ran that line in the middle of the 19th century, right? It's legitimate to crack down on secessionist effects or efforts, and that's, you know, also allowed by the UN Charter. So you have this standoff between a state or a perpetrator that says we're acting on the grounds of security, and the victims who say we're being attacked solely because we're on the grounds of our identity, not because we've done anything, when in fact some members of that group have done something. Okay, so this is the sort of conceptual standoff you've got, and it occurred during the war in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, where Caspar Weinberger was, you know, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, was asked, you know, why don't the Americans intervene to protect the Bosnians, and he said, from the Serbs, and he said, well, I see Serbian militias there. I don't remember Jewish militias as armed combatants during the Second World War in the Holocaust. In fact, of course, there were Jewish partisans and so forth. However, you know, that was an ex post facto, or they weren't the reason why the Nazis were committing the Holocaust. You know, they were defending themselves from the Holocaust. So there's a chicken and egg complex. It's a complex issue, but we'll come back to some of these themes.
Dirk, so you propose, and your understanding of the term genocide. So actually, what are the implications of this to the field? That is, do you propose that we will not use genocide anymore? What are the implications for the legal field of genocide? What are the implications for the academic field itself? Okay. For the journal that you are editing?
Okay, so the normative standpoint of the book is the protection of civilians. Okay, just to back up a little bit, and we'll help answer your question, because I'm starting from the standpoint of the the moral standpoint, if you like, ethical standpoint of the Geneva Convention, or the International Committee of the Red Cross that guards the Geneva Conventions, which is the principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Now, historians and political sciences have written about this, you know, whether it's problematic and so forth. Well, let's leave that to one side, okay? If, as Western powers have said throughout the 19th century and onwards, that civilized warfare is distinguishable from barbaric or savage warfare by distinguishing between combatants and civilians, then I think we need to take that at its word, right? And then I was interested in how genocide is so selective in the civilians that it's protecting. Okay, it's protecting ethnic, racial, national, and religious groups, not civilians as such. Okay, now they're protected by other measures like crimes against humanity and so forth. But and war crimes. One of the other problems of genocide, Amos and Alon, is that there's a strict hierarchy in public memory about mass crimes. Genocide is routinely called the crime of crimes. Now, even though the ICC doesn't really distinguish them in that way, in practice, everybody knows that there is a hierarchy of genocide, for example, of a hierarchy of criminality. For example, when the UN report on Darfur came out, and I think it was 2007, and said that there were crimes against humanity and persecution being committed, but not genocide, there was an audible sigh of relief from Khartoum and from the African Union. Oh, not so bad then. You know, the genocide has this particular stigma, and it's because of its relationship to the Holocaust, right? And the other mass crimes against civilians don't have that stigma. Now, why is that? Now, that's a major problem of genocide. So what I'm getting at, and this is now more directly addressing your question, Alon, is that genocide as a concept and as a moral affect, you know, that which shocks us, right, is standing in the way of recognizing the kinds of civilian destruction that we see depicted on the cover of my book. Now, is it possible to put in the chat a link as well? There's the cover of the book, and also the link to the original picture. Now, that image is by a fantastic Yemeni street artist called Murad Subay, who paints pictures on ruins of buildings and where civilians in the Yemeni war were killed. In this case, he's drawn the family that was actually killed in this building, and this was on the wall at the back of the room, which you can see in the link, I hope. And then he's painted a raven on it to show their terrible fate. Now, why is it that victims, innocent victims of in military encounters don't shock our conscience in the same way? Why is it that those victims are not capital V victims? Now, in the book, I talk about the construction of the victim in Western and now global consciousness, and it is derived from Holocaust victims, you know, utterly passive in theory, if not in practice, right? Passive, agentless, apolitical. Whereas it would be argued, well, these people are the unfortunate collateral damage of a military conflict. And so, I mean, this is the terrible implication. They can't somehow kind of vicariously liable for what's going on. Their suffering is less important. It shouldn't really be, you know, it shouldn't really shock us. Now, I reject that. The book is a history of how we came to this grading of civilian destruction, that which is shocking and that which is not shocking. Okay, so what the implication for the field is, in a utopian world, Alon, would be actually to do away with the concept of genocide and replace it with permanent security. And I know that's one of your next questions, so I'll elaborate what permanent security is later. Now, in a non-utopian world, you know, we're stuck with this concept. It's really part of the vocabulary of the language of transgression for everyone now, and it'd be, you know, it's hard to imagine doing away with it. So what I would like to then add permanent security to this vocabulary by pointing out that what the UN calls mass atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing are all subtended by a logic of permanent security. That that's what unites them. Okay. Now we can elaborate what permanent security is, you know, later in our discussion. just as a footnote to that, I have, as a result, been with the others who edit the journal. I'm not a king philosopher here. We have a collective, and I just direct the traffic. There are 5 of us. If you go to our website, we have started to include non-genocidal cases of mass killing and civilian destruction in the journal. If you go to the website now, you'll see we have a special forum on civilian destruction in Syria, where genocide isn't probably the right word, unless you're talking about Yazidis, perhaps, by 4 young emigre Syrian scholars that we've mobilized. And in the next couple of days, we'll also be putting online a forum on what's happening in Tigray in Ethiopia, okay, where genocide isn't probably the right word either. However, we're talking about the mass destruction of civilians, and that's what interests us. We think that's more important than hair splitting over about whether something's categorizable as genocide or not.
Hey, Dirk, we will get back to this permanent security concept, but first, it's a long book, and you have a narrative there, and it's a very different from most narratives about telling the story of the concept of genocide, of the convention. In most accounts of this concept, Raphael Lemkin is usually portrayed as the hero, or against all odds changed the world in this sense. And you're very critical of Raphael Lemkin. You put his image, you somehow upside down. Can you, is this a fair description? And tell how do you depict his image and and actually his big project?
Okay, well, it's true that it's not a Lemkin-centric and Lemkin hagiographical book, right? But I wouldn't call it a inversion where he's now the baddie either, right? So that's how it's been misread by a number of scholars, because they're so invested, I think, in Lemkin as a moral hero. If they don't see that reflected back to them in a kind of narcissistic gaze, because they see themselves as latter-day Lemkins, then they're sort of vexed, and what I'm writing is a proper history for the first time, as I see it, like a proper historical, methodologically rigorous and exacting account. Now that means the following. First, you don't write the history of the genocide concept as we all did in the past, and I myself am one of the guilty ones 20 years ago, by restricting yourself to Lemkin's papers. Now, Lemkin's papers are spread around mainly North America, and I've gone and copied them, and I've been, working through them for decades and written quite a lot about genocide and, about Lemkin in essays here and there. And it was lazy intellectual history in the sense that I restricted myself to his, quite selective Nachlass, as the Germans say, right? His papers, so you sort of saw things from his perspective, his correspondence chains with the various people, his text and so forth. No, a satisfactory intellectual history means putting thinkers into context. Okay, and that's what I do in chapters 3, 4, and 5, where I show, first of all, I reconstruct the debate about civilian destruction more generally, before the concept of genocide, in the 90s and 20s and 30s and into the early 40s. I show that there was already quite a lively discussion going on in which Lemkin becomes, because he's very young at the time, he's only born in 1900, is a very minor player, by the time of the early 40s. He's still he's an obscure emigre international lawyer down the road here at Duke University, right, where they gave him a very poorly paid adjunct position for a little while. And then he was employed by the US government and moved around a bit. Now, so in reconstructing this international debate about crimes against civilians, I demonstrated, and here I drew on lots of secondary literature. It's not as if I'm the only one to do this. A lot of other people have done it already, but for different purposes. That there was a debate about what happened in the First World War. What happened with the Armenians, and what are the legal remedies, if any, available since then? Because there was an important, or rather pressing, Armenian refugee crisis, along with a Russian revolutionary refugee crisis in the 1920s. So and there were a lot of Armenian intellectuals in Western capitals and those who advocated for them, like André Mandelstam, who ended up in Paris, right? So there was the constant discussion about the crimes of the Ottoman Empire, even though there were really no legal remedies. But there was a debate about legal reform in the context of the League of Nations, like how do we prevent this in the future, or at least criminalize it, okay? And there's terrific new scholarship on this right now. Now, there was also a parallel discussion about aerial warfare, which had begun during the First World War, and everybody understood that with the improvements in technology, aerial technology, that aerial bombing would become a serious challenge for everyone, strategically and also in terms of international law. So there was a draft Hague Convention on aerial bombing in 1923, but it was never ratified and really became part of international law. Now, it's in this context that Lemkin starts to sort of write things in the context of actually debate about terrorism in the League of Nations in the early 1930s. And he proposes these terms barbarism and vandalism, which everybody's picked up on as the sort of the forerunner to genocide. And he did himself to sort of narrativize that into a teleological account, which is very misleading, because that was a debate in the early 30s about a League of Nations Convention on terrorism, which pertained to assassinations of state leaders, destroying state infrastructure and so forth. Really nothing to do with genocide. Though he tried to introduce, the persecution of minorities in the context of the minority treaties, and that is important. The thing which is a game changer is of course the Second World War and all the crimes that the German Staat Committee in occupied territories in Europe, and so that debate starts in the late 30s and the early 40s, because even by 1942, 43, everybody could see that the Allies would eventually win the war. So it was a question of preparing the war crimes trials, and everybody wanted to have successful war crimes trials, unlike the failed ones at the end of the First World War. Wanted to make them work this time. But international law, it was perceived by many of the small nations, so-called small nations, the emigre governments in exile in London, the Czechoslovaks, the Polish, the Belgians, the French, and so forth. And they all had, there was a cottage industry of international lawyers from those states that met in London, and various scholars are working on this so-called London moment right now to thrash out a new international law on prosecuting what the Nazis had done. Because people could see that international law as it existed in the Hague Conventions was insufficient. It had been invented before the First World War for circumstances that couldn't imagine what the Nazis were doing. Now, Lemkin participates in that debate, and what he's trying to do with the genocide concept, which he invents in 1943, it's only published a year later in Access for All in Occupied Europe, is augment the Hague Conventions by adding, a new indictment called genocide, the destruction of nations. Right now, I reconstruct how he did that in dialogue with other emigre thinkers, and no one's really done this before in quite this depth. And you can see very clearly how he borrows ideas from the Polish government in exile, the Institute for Jewish Affairs, which was a think tank from the World Jewish Congress, which was staffed by emigre Jewish intellectual social scientists in New York. And he borrows a lot of ideas from them, and then comes up with this in some ways brilliant new idea called genocide, which is an attempt to bridge the gap that existed between the Christian, if you want to call them that, governments in exile, the Poles, the Czechoslovak, and so on, and the World Jewish Congress, which were pursuing different agendas and were not talking to each other. The point of dissensus there was that the World Jewish Congress understandably wanted the Allies to have in what became the Nuremberg trials, to have a separate Jewish indictment, the crime of the attempt to destroy the Jewish people, right? And the Allied diplomats said no, and the diplomats from the so-called small nations, the Czechs, the Poles, and so forth, also refused the World Jewish Congress attempt for the World Jewish Congress to represent their Jewish citizens. Right? The Polish government said, no, we are the representatives of all Polish citizens, whether Jewish or Christian. Okay, so there was a dissensus there, and the compromise that Lemkin did come up with this concept of genocide was to formulate it so broadly that it included what was then called the crippling of nations, not even a term he invented, but then adopted, as well as, total extermination. So the Jewish experience, was thought of in terms of total extermination, as people continue to think today. No one thought of, the Polish, the large Polish nation being totally exterminated, but denationalized. Its intelligentsia destroyed, its priestly class destroyed, its educational institutions destroyed, and then all you're left with is a helot class of peasants who can work for the Germans as virtual slaves, right? So as a nation, it's destroyed, although there are still physical Poles there, right? So people talked about that as crippling a nation, or destroying it as a nation, but not with physical total extermination. So Lemkin then puts these two ideas together in one concept for a diplomatic purpose, in order to bridge this tension between the World Jewish Congress, and he's in close touch with these people. He knows what the anxieties and concerns are. He's a lawyer himself, and the Polish government exile, with whom he was also in contact. Now, what people forget in these teleological accounts of the development of international law is that he failed in the first instance. Genocide was not included as a major indictment in the Nuremberg trials. It was crimes against humanity. And that's why people are also interested in Hirsch-Lauterpacht and the history of the notion of crimes against humanity. Kerstin von Lingen at the University of Vienna, for example, has written an important book on that, and other people are working on those too. I mean, Philippe Sands, for example, has written this very compelling book where he connects Lauterpacht, his grandfather, and Lemkin, because they were all in one town, the same town in East Central Europe, and studied at the same university around the same time. And I wrote a review of it if anyone's interested. It's a stunningly written book, but I've tried to write a different book, which is less driven by heroic personalities or tragic figures, and more by the complex interaction which leads to contingent outcomes which are not inevitable. By that I mean the following. So Lemkin fails in getting genocide to be recognized at the Nuremberg trials, right? What happens at the Nuremberg trials, as some of you may know, is that the Allies restrict the application of crimes against humanity because they don't want to set a precedent where it could apply to their own countries, i.e. in peacetime. It's restricted just to wartime cases. So the Americans don't want, the crimes against African Americans and included for the future. And the Russians don't want, the many crimes against their own civilians included. And the French, who are also part of the Nuremberg London Charter, as well as the British, aren't particularly interested in either, because they have their own crimes to contend within their empires. Now, the World Jewish Congress and the small nations are very upset about this. And a month after the end of the major war criminal case against in Nuremberg, so I think that's October 1946, a month later, the General Assembly of the UN passes a resolution for a genocide convention. It's in reaction to the failure of Nuremberg rather than inspired by it. You see, it's kind of a zigzag movement rather than sort of an upward growth of, humanitarian consciousness, as they tell you at law school, right? And in political science seminars. And that's where, Lemkin is involved in heavy lobbying, but he makes many compromises there. He's willing to drop cultural genocide and a lot of the broader aspects in order to get it through the United Nations, and then ultimately, into a convention 2 years later in late 1948.
Dirk, I'd like us to discuss a little bit more the issue of permanent security. Basically, you propose that in place of genocide, we will use permanent security. Why permanent security and not security? Why permanent security and not national interest? You also mentioned liberal permanent security. Actually, this is a very important part of your argument. What do you mean? Permanent security seems to me so vague, a kind of a political science term. Can you think of maybe to describe it in historical terms? And yeah.
I'm glad you've asked me that, because it's one of the pillars of the book. The subtitle you recall is Permanent Security and the Language of Transgression. I've already talked a bit about the language of transgression. And just to wrap that thread up, you know, the language of transgression has this 500-year history, which some people see culminating in the term genocide in 1948 as part of the Human Rights Revolution with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth. I see it as the opposite. It actually sets the threshold of that which shocks the conscience of mankind much higher than it did before, because now the Holocaust is there to shock everyone, you know, and understandably it did. So that in setting the threshold so high and making the genocide concept resemble the Holocaust in these negotiations about the definition of genocide, it actually makes less, not so shocking anymore, all the other kinds of state crime that go on. Okay, and that leads me now to the issue of permanent security. Where does this strange term come from? Now, it's actually a Nazi term in some ways. I was always intrigued by the rhetoric of security in all cases of mass violence against civilians, which I've written about. You know, I've edited 10 books or so mainly on genocide. And I've covered and written about many cases in colonial context and in Germany. And in all of them, military and state authorities constantly talk about their victims as security threats. And I do think they mean it. It's ubiquitous. And, you know, racial or ethnic hatred is there, but it's not the cause. I mean, if racial hatred was the cause of these things, why is the Armenian genocide taking place during the First World War? Why is the Holocaust taking place in the Second World War? Why didn't these things take place much earlier, you know, during peacetime? You know, these world wars are clearly an important explanatory context. You know, the fact of difference, if you like, is not the cause of mass violence against civilians. You need two processes now, to use the jargon. You need racialization and securitization. It's when an ethnic or other kind of human group, collective, is seen as dangerous and threatening, that they need to be eliminated. Okay, these threats may be real or imagined. You know, we'll get to the hallucinatory quality of some of these threats later. I mean, that's particularly prevalent in the case of the Holocaust. You know, where Jews in Germany were in no way an objective threat to even the Nazi project, right? But we'll get to that, how I narrate that as a security threat next. Now, where do I get this term from? It was a term I came across in reading the transcripts of one of the later Nuremberg trials, the so-called the military trials, which were conducted by the US government and not by the International Military Tribunal. And these were of the lesser war criminals, not the major war criminals. In this case, it was the leader of Einsatzgruppen D, Otto Ohlendorf, whose Einsatzgruppe, special action unit, was responsible for killing about 90,000 Jews during the Second World War. I hope I don't need to explain what the Einsatzgruppen are for your listeners, right? They can look that up. Now, he was asked in his trial, you know, what are you guys doing killing all these Jewish civilians, right? I'm just paraphrasing here, right? And he said, you have to understand, we weren't just interested in security, you know, which all armies are, right? We are interested in permanent security, permanente Sicherheit, because, you know, we are establishing a 1,000-year Reich. This is forever, not just a temporary securing of the land, you know, while our army is in the field, right? And that means, you know, when he was pressed on that, he said that means we need to exterminate future threats. We need to anticipate threats. And then he was asked, well, why would you kill children? You know, they're not combatants, right? To get into that legalistic language, you know, civilians and combatants, because it wasn't illegal to kill partisans. Okay. Now, he said, you have to understand that those Jewish children will grow up and become partisans. They will become our enemies as active combatants. So we have to kill them. Now, this is where comparative history is significant, right? When I read that, I thought, oh, that sounds familiar. That's the nits make lice argument that was used in the American frontier to kill Native American children. You've got to kill the baby lice before they, the nits, before they grow up and become warriors, and the women. And that way you have a permanent solution, a final solution to the Indian problem. Okay, so the comparative historian in me sees there is a pattern in world history of in military context of expansion, conquest, empire, where groups are seen as security threats, and then an occupier or a military or a militia even has a choice. You can either deal with a direct security threat, like actual combatants. You can lock them up. You can even shoot them, right? But killing the women and the children, non-combatants, in order to forestall future threats, is moving into a different dimension. Then the security becomes permanent security. And that's the difference, right? Everybody wants to feel secure, right? But no one has a right to permanent security and absolute safety. I mean, if you want to feel absolute safety, where no one can threaten you, go and live on an island, with koala bears, right? They're not going to threaten you, right? But human community or human existence implies human community, living with other people, and a measure of some kind of trust. No one has a right to permanent security. It's actually a deeply utopian and sinister and paranoid aim. Let's put it this way. The difference between vigilance and hypervigilance is apposite. Everybody has a basic level of vigilance. You walk down the street and someone comes to strike you, you naturally defend yourself. Hypervigilance means looking around actively for and anticipating threats, and maybe even attacking someone you think may attack you, right? So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in that mode of paranoia, right? And that's what you got in a really extreme case in the Holocaust, where the Nazis wanted to anticipate a Jewish security threat, which they read off the end of the First World War. They wanted to prevent a rerun of 1917, 1918, when the home front was crippled by mass strikes, and which they attributed to leftists and the liberal Jewish press. Okay, and they wanted to prevent that again. So the first people they lock up in 1933 are Jews and communists and socialists. I mean, for them, this was a completely rational security exercise. Now, I'm not attributing any legitimacy to that, but as historians, you need to understand how the perpetrators reason. Okay, and then without saying, and this is the problem with Ernst Nolte, the German historian, who said, and yes, they were right to do so. We don't do that. I mean, the Nazis were not right to do so, but neither were the American colonists in killing women and children in the nits make lice argument, because it's one thing to engage in security. It's another thing to engage in permanent security. That's where it flips over into a criminal enterprise.
So you actually write in your book a few instances of permanent security also by liberal regimes where mass atrocities are committed. And let's leave it as it is, and we'll move forward because our time is running short.
Right. You wanted me to talk about that. Could I quickly make this? Look, it's I make a distinction. It is important between liberal and illiberal permanent security, because otherwise, if we leave it at this sort of flat, undifferentiated level, you license the, I think, untenable proposition that the American empire is the same as the Nazi one. Because they all engage in permanent security, right? Now, that's an untenable equation, right? However, I do think that the American empire, like the British one before it, was engaged in permanent security and strategic vision and an attempt to do that, and killed lots of civilians doing so. Okay. Now, this is a post-liberal position on my part. The liberal position, which I'm opposing, is that which, say, is hegemonic in Germany and the US, which is, the Holocaust was the crime of crimes, and we oppose that, and it's okay to drop bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and flatten German cities and kill all these civilians in doing so, in opposing that, right? Now, my view is actually no. If you're serious about this distinction between civilians and combatants, you can't drop nuclear bombs on cities anymore. You can't flatten them with fire bombs, right? According to their logic, is that you keep fighting the war until you win. And that means, according to that logic, you could kill as many civilians as the genocidal regime you're opposing. Do you see the fatal nature of that thinking? Well, I'm opposing that thinking. And I'm suggesting that the key distinction is illiberal regimes like the Nazi one are committing their crimes, genocide would be the main one, in the name of their ethnos, the German people, for example. Liberal regimes, like the British Empire in the 19th century, well into the 20th, and since the Second World War, the American Empire, they are expanding their remit in the name of humanity. And that's what makes it liberal. It's a global rather than geographically circumscribed aspiration, right? Now, I don't think that since the Second World War, America has been committing genocide, right? It's not the right concept there. However, the Americans killed quite a lot of people in North Korea, maybe 2 million civilians in the early 50s in the war there. How many people talk about that? I mean, that's 2 million people, right? No one knows about that except specialists. How many civilians died in Vietnam, where people did try to argue the genocide case and it didn't stick? The conceptual stretching didn't work. I thought, but we need to come up with a vocabulary that does draw attention to the outrageous policies that the Americans were pursuing there. And just to say, well, it's not genocide and shrug our shoulders is inadequate. But that's actually the consensus. The problem is international law, as it's currently conceived, doesn't capture all the manifestations, of permanent security, because international law was written by the victors in World War II, who were the liberal empires and the Americans. And so they fashioned international law to blind us or not cover the kind of actions they engage in, mainly in aerial bombing of various kinds, to maintain their empires. I think the tremendous civilian destruction that's been going on with drone strikes, so-called surgical drone strikes over the last 20 years is a great case in point. In fact, I begin the book with that. Okay. Now, they are obviously more surgical than bombing cities with nuclear weapons, right? We're talking about 10, 20 people, 3 people at a time, right? But if you are, and this is the important link to make, if you are engaged in a permanent global war on terror, as has been proclaimed for the last 20 years, and maybe it's been going on since the 40s and 50s, then given the allowance of collateral damage in international law, you are in liberal permanent security countenancing the permanent killing of civilians as acceptable in the name of freedom. And that's what we've seen in the global war on terror in the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed, and many of them by so-called surgical drone and other missile strikes, like the ones depicted on the cover of this book, though in this case by Saudi ordnance. But where did they get that ordnance from?
I want to move on and let also our other participants ask questions, and I really encourage whoever has, there was so much put on the table here, so please feel free to ask questions, and we will not be able to ask all of them, but we will certainly try to pick some of them, to choose some of them. But before we move on to the question and answer, I want to connect you and ask you if there's a connection. You are now involved in a very you published a very controversial but intriguing essay which is German Catechism, many intellectuals in Israel, from Germany, from US, from all over the world, and Israel jumped in, and it's in the debate is still going on. So, what's actually your argument there, and what do you see at stake in these discussions? And a follow up on this: is it connected also to your book, or in what ways it is connected?
Yeah, are you going to give the listeners who aren't privy to the debate a bit of context, or you want me to do that, Amos?
Go ahead.
Okay, so in May this year, I published a not long 3,000 or 4,000 word piece in a Swiss online journal called Geschichte der Gegenwart, though it's in English as well as German. You can find the link on my website, if the modestly called dirkmoses.com, if you're interested. And I wrote this. Some people think it's polemical. I don't think it's polemical, but I wrote it in response to observations I'd made of what's been going on in Germany for the last 2 years in particular, but over a longer period, where liberal and leftist Jewish and non-Jewish scholars like Judith Butler, Michael Rothberg, the African intellectual Achille Mbembe, and others were serially cancelled because they were seen to have made statements critical of Israel, or they were committing the outrageous crime of placing the Holocaust in context other than the history of anti-Semitism. For example, Michael's book on multi-directional memory, as it was perceived, was desacralizing the Holocaust or demonumentalizing it. And if there's anything you can say about the status of Holocaust memory in Germany, is that the Holocaust is this is now in public culture rather than in the scholarly world, although there too perhaps, the Holocaust is central to national identity, and that's been, so it has a monumental status. And the German Chancellor Merkel in 2008 went so far as to say that Israel's security is intrinsic to Germany's Staatsräson, to its raison d'etre. Now, people like Judith Butler and these others I mentioned were persecuted, frankly, in a kind of heresy trials. They were sort of expunged from the public sphere because they were perceived as having questioned that orthodoxy, which I call a catechism, which is a Christian notion, obviously. And I consciously chose that rather than commandments to indicate it's I'm talking about a Christian rather than a Jewish Old Testament set of injunctions here, in order to avoid any confusion, right? Nonetheless, people couldn't help themselves and said, Dirk is engaging in, Christian anti-Semitism here. They looked up Wikipedia and saw, my own family background, blah, blah. It was quite unedifying, actually. But people clearly were triggered. And because I feel I identified, these 5 elements of the catechism, which, are the 5 propositions which cannot be questioned, and I pointed out, well, each of these propositions can be questioned and is already being questioned by scholars. And I just went through and explained how and why that was the case very briefly, and doing so in a compact way, summarizing, decades of scholarship. Now, rather than leading to more insight, it led to, more blindness, if you like. And then people, in a sense, acted out the rhetorical tropes and discursive disciplining procedures which I explained in the piece, by then treating me and my person and the arguments in the same way as these other people. So while the debate in Germany was in English in the New Fascism syllabus, was critical but interesting, and there were people who supported my positions and then elaborated and took it further, the German discussion has been nothing short of hysterical. It went so far that Jürgen Habermas himself, who was at the center of the Historikerstreit in the mid-80s, and is in a sense the philosopher of the Catechism, right, wrote an article in a one-page short piece in a philosophy magazine, beginning of last month, in which he said, "Hey, addressed to me personally, what many of the points he's making about the necessity of introducing migrant perspectives into Germany, into the German debate, that German memory isn't frozen, and that we do need to take account of colonial crimes. This is important." Now, in doing so, he was saying to people, stop the polemicization, right? At the same time, though, he reiterated various elements of the catechism, though the tone was respectful and sober, everything you'd expect from Habermas. And it's a pity there's not been more of it. Hanno Lervi wrote reasonably piece in that spirit in the Taz on the weekend or so, which takes Habermas's inspiration. But some Israeli colleagues, all old, or sort of on the cusp of retirement or retired, who are the protagonists of these debates in the 80s, feel though rather threatened by any questioning of the way German memory works and the way its unqualified support of Israeli military conduct is evolving. People may not know, not only does Germany, give nuclear submarines, I think they're nuclear, to Israel, but it also supports the Israeli and American attempt to thwart the ICC efforts to investigate crimes committed in these various Gaza campaigns, crimes on both sides, of course, Hamas as well as Israel, which is, not particularly reconcilable with the German big game talk on human rights and international law. So when you just point that out, say, hang on, guys, isn't there a bit of a contradiction here? And why is this taking place? People really go crazy, and it's difficult to have a rational conversation. I've written, back in various articles, mainly in German, but the debate goes on, and unfortunately, as friends report from the front in Germany, it's getting worse. And to give you an example of how bad it is, a Palestinian German doctor and journalist, Enemi El-Hassan, who's in her late 20s, was recently booted off a science program as to be the moderator because she'd liked some tweets on Instagram from Jewish Voices for Peace. And this was considered anti-Israel, and therefore it meant it was impossible to put her before the camera as it was put. So in this mode, anti-Semitism, I'm obviously anti-Semitism too, right? Anti-Semitism, right? But in this mode in Germany, it's become a kind of racism, a way of policing the affects and activism of migrant Germans.
Dirk, there is a question that relates exactly to what you just discussed. So I'd like to take it. It's from Harold Marcuse, and I'm going to read it. Your remark that you have historicized the concept of genocide by excavating its antecedents back to Las Casas, which I think you have done brilliantly, reminds me of the well-known exchange between Saul Friedlander and Martin Borchardt on the historicization of National Socialism. This exchange took place some decades ago, in which Borchardt, a German historian, said that we need to historicize the Third Reich. It was in the 1980s, it was not common. And Friedlander said, no, it's too early, maybe we can never historicize it. There are here issues of genocide, of victimhood, etc. I think it is crucial to distinguish why someone is attempting to historicize a historical occurrence. That is to say, normalize and contextualize and place back into the flow of history. So looking back, do you think that Borchardt was attempting his historicization with an apologetic intent, or perhaps not? It sounds to me like several of your critics in the German catechism debate are accusing you of doing the same thing. And Marcuse said that he sees both you and Borchardt attempting to take the Nazi Holocaust off of its pedestal as the pinnacle of the crime of crimes. What would you say?
Okay, a couple of things there. I mean, I'm well aware of the Broschard-Friedlander debate. I mean, this was going on while I was a student. And I think Harold and I discussed it when we were together on a Friedrich Ebert Stiftung bus tour to Poland and Auschwitz, probably in 1996, 5 or something like that. So we've been discussing these things for a long time, and I'm glad to see Harold chiming in here. Now, in fact, the critics in Germany have gone further. They've said that I'm, like the new Nolte, who's a much more sinister figure than Martin Broschard, actively apologizing for the Nazi regime. And Mischa Brumlik went so far in his review of my stuff, and of course he hadn't read my book. He's just basing it on newspaper articles, hasn't gone to the trouble of reading any scholarship. And he said, da schwingt eine gewisse Nazi-Apologetik mit, which is an outrageous statement, saying that, in this explication of trying to understand what the Nazis thought they were doing, he's apologizing for it. I mean, I don't bother replying to ad hominem and misguided and wrong-headed statements like that, which clearly misunderstand the attempt of historians to comprehend what their subjects think they're doing. Okay? Obviously, you reconstruct it. It doesn't mean you approve of it, obviously, right? I am interested in the mentality of perpetrators. Oddly, we do that in genocide studies. Now, I think it's important to understand, what Broschard was advocating, and then why Friedlander was resisting it. Because I'm actually on the Friedlander side here. Broschard was saying we need to have the ability and the freedom to write about, the Nazi period and insert it into the continuum of German history without feeling inhibited, without feeling that we constantly refer to the Holocaust as or the Nazi regime even as a human rights perpetrator. For example, when writing about the history of I don't know if he uses this example, but this would be the kind of way he's reasoning. If you're writing the history of the German railways, for example, right, you could write starting in 1900 and finish in 1960, right? And you could just write about, the timetable and, and so forth, and, the personnel and, the trade unions that were involved in it, right? And it would be a history of the railways. But Friedlander was saying, no, you have to make the epistemological starting point of any such account the fact that the railways were transporting Jews to Auschwitz and other camps, and that in a sense becomes the telos of the account, at least until the 40s, right? Otherwise, you're kind of normalizing the an historiographical mode, which is amoral, right? Now, my generation, I was an undergrad at the time, we're all on Friedlander's side. And I still am. What I'm trying to say, what I am saying is that we need to expand this epistemological empathy with the victim to other victims, okay, like the Herero and Nama in Africa, or other victims of the Holocaust. Now, Amos Goldberg and Alon Confino have written about, in the scholarly literature, about Charles Friedlander's monumental 2-volume works on Nazi Germany and the Jews, right? In which he purports to write an integrated history of the Holocaust, because he wants to integrate, and he does, Jews as the prime victims of the Holocaust, into a narrative of Nazi Germany over those years, right? And as I read your observations, your sympathetic engagement but critical engagement, is that it's not quite integrated yet because it hasn't integrated all the other victims, right? Now, that's one thing, right? The other thing is that in the post-war period in Germany, since the Historikerstreit, I mean, since Friedlander's interventions against or with, because it was a respectful exchange with Broschard, it wasn't like the exchange between Habermas and Nolte, which was really toxic or very political and in a sense in the public sphere, not an academic exchange. Since then, the Holocaust has this, Friedlander won. The Habermas in a sense gave it philosophical garb, and the victim's perspective has triumphed. So, the German political culture in the Holocaust memorial and the rest of the aspects of German memorial culture, centralizes quite rightly the victim's perspective. Young Germans empathize not with their Nazi grandparents or great grandparents, but with the Jewish victims. I see this again and again when I spend time there, right? And there've been lots studied on this. And my first book was about this kind of thing, right? Now, the problem, I mean, that's a gain, a civilizational gain. What we need to now is take that a step further. Now that Germany is much more diverse, there are other, when people are much more conscious that the Nazis were racist generally. They didn't like black people. They didn't like Arabs, despite any diplomatic overtures they made to Arab movements to rebel against the French and the British empires, right? They thought all these people were racially inferior, right? So what do you do when you have blacks and Arabs in Germany today? Do you learn the lessons of the Nazi past, which is, well, there is a tradition of anti-black, anti-Arab racism in Germany, and we're continuing that today? Or do you say, no, we are stuck, or we restrict ourselves to a monumentalized view of the Nazi regime, which is just the Holocaust, and we forget all the other aspects of the Nazi regime? I mean, in a way, the way the memory is working in Germany is allowing the continuity of other types of racism, which poisons German political culture. And the campaign against Nemi al-Hassan is a perfect example of that.
So we are running out of time, and we have there are a lot of questions, but I will ask only one last question, which will bring us, I think, back to your book. So you say settler colonialism trends towards the ending of colonial difference. Can you elaborate on the role that permanent security as an idea and practice might play in this homogenization project? What role might scholars who adopt this terminology then play in the process of secularization that lends itself to the maintenance of homogeneity?
Okay, it's a very academic question.
I wanted to bring it back to your book.
Yeah, I'm teaching a seminar on settler colonial history in global perspective right now. So if I'm not mistaken, that point about settler colonialism, what was that phrase, leading to its own negation through the homogenization of the other? I mean, that's a point made by Lorenzo Veracini again and again. I mean, Patrick Wolf came up with the terms, genocide, settler colonial, invasion as a structure, not an event. And the logic of elimination as that which drives settler colonialism. And Lorenzo Veracini then, took this a step further, or adapted it by saying, whereas regular colonialism maintains the difference between the colonizer and the colonized because they want to exploit the labor of the colonized, settler colonialism, by contrast, doesn't want the colonized, they want their land. So, either they expel or murder the colonized indigenous people, or once they're inside the frontier, you assimilate them. You take their children, put them into boarding schools, you take their land, and so forth, and the Allotment Act. So now, of course, if that's true, and settler colonialism tends in this direction, of course, indigenous people resist it. And that's why we have indigenous people remaining in Australia and the US and so forth, right? If in small number. Now, and in some cases, they're getting their land back, right? So, I mean, that is a resistance to the logic of permanent security. So, yes, homogenization projects are a manifestation of permanent security because they efface, adopt, digest the other, who can never therefore be threatening to the project of the occupier, of the supremacist people.
Okay. Alon, I think we should wrap up.
We have many questions, but we ran out of time.
Sorry, my answers were too long, and we've run out of time. My apologies to to those people who've asked questions.
There's still much more to talk, and we recommend the book. And maybe we'll have you again here, Dirk. And we thank all of you. There were many participants. Great. Thank you, Dirk, and thank you, Amos, and thank you all.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in and for listening to my ravings. Okay, hope they were useful. Okay.